Hello, space friends, Captain Snuggles here. I recently wrapped up my AI combat testing for X4 version 8.0, and with the next round of updates already on the horizon for 2026, I want to talk about what those updates might mean in the context of my testing. Specifically, Egosoft has said that they intend to rebalance the game's weapons, turrets, and shields, and they also intend to make some AI upgrades. First things first, basic definitions. I do my combat testing on the macro scale. Ship classes, weapon categories, simulation modes, etc. When Egosoft has said rebalance in the past, the adjustments they've made have had close to zero impact at that macro scale. For example, 7.5 included a rebalance of all engines, all thrusters, every mobility-related statistic on every single ship, and non-mobility stats on a decent subset of ships. 7.5 also included the new flight model, the new boost system, and a set of AI changes. Then 7.6 made even more adjustments and more AI changes. Then 8.0 made even more adjustments and even more AI changes. So that's one comprehensive rebalance, 3 sets of AI upgrades, and a bunch of other really significant changes. All that has had a net zero impact on the relative performance of ship classes in combat. The only measurable impact it's had at the macro scale is that it's tipped the scales a bit more heavily in favor of burst weapons over sustained DPS weapons, which isn't so much a change as it is an amplification of a pre-existing trend. All the other changes came from bugs or bug fixes, not from the rebalance or AI upgrades. All of which is to say, Egosoft does not balance and upgrade at the macro scale. They balance and upgrade at the micro scale. That isn't a bad thing at all. 7.5 added some real depth and nuance to the selection of ships and engines, and I think we can do a lot by applying that same philosophy of depth and nuance to ships' offensive and defensive systems. It's just important to acknowledge that, based on all available evidence, that's what we're talking about. Small changes that will add up to a more nuanced system overall. Now, set that aside for a minute, and let's talk about the other side of the equation. My testing identified several imbalances at the macro scale that I think are objectively severe enough to require correction, even in a single-player game. Now, how could I possibly make that determination? Well, by looking at time requirements. X4 isn't a game that you can really lose. The player is always guaranteed to succeed. The only question is how much time it takes, in terms of both the time required to directly implement their strategy and the time required to amass the necessary in-game resources. So, the question in my mind is, when we see 2 or more strategies with really big disparities in time requirements, what does the player gain by choosing to make the higher time investment? Based on my testing, I think there are 3 pairs of combat strategies where one strategy requires a dramatically higher time investment without offering the player anything quantifiable in return. The first imbalance, surprise surprise, is using direct combat capital ships instead of subcapitals for fleet combat. Destroyers and battleships require roughly triple the initial investment, about 4 times the upkeep cost, and roughly triple the direct implementation time for ship-to-ship combat, and against stations, they're similarly less effective, with the single, solitary exception being Ka'ak installations. Moreover, they don't do anything to amplify the effectiveness of hybrid fleets. If you take a fighter-based fleet and replace some of the fighters with an equivalent value of destroyers, the fleet's effectiveness decreases. So, currently, any investment in destroyers or battleships requires a disproportionately huge time investment by the player, and in exchange, the player gets some cool aesthetics and increased effectiveness against the game's least common station type. And frankly, that is not enough. The second big imbalance I found is the power of burst weapons as opposed to sustained DPS weapons or any turrets. In low attention, the issue is that accuracy basically doesn't exist for primary weapons, and if anything can hit anything, the thing with more damage wins. In high attention, the dynamics are more complex, but basically the AI's offensive behavior heavily favors burst weapons in subcapital versus capital engagements, and the AI's defensive behavior heavily favors burst weapons in subcapital versus subcapital engagements. With the caveat that accuracy actually exists in high attention, so we're obviously talking about the subcategory of burst weapons that can actually hit the target. The disparity in player time investment required between burst and sustained weapons is pretty big. It varies between high and low attention, but overall we're talking about roughly 50% greater initial resource investment, double the upkeep costs, and double the direct implementation time, and in exchange there's really nothing that sustained DPS weapons do better than burst weapons. Then, big imbalances 1 and 2 get even more severe when they're paired with big imbalance 3, which is high versus low attention. Averaged across all the ship types I tested, fighting in high attention requires about 50% greater initial resource investment, 2 to 3 times the upkeep costs, and 50% greater direct implementation time compared to low attention. That's a lower disparity than the other two imbalances, but again, they have compounding effects, and this one is arguably the most painful because you're basically being penalized just for being present during combat, and I'm willing to bet that the majority of X4 players really want to be present during combat. So, we have our 3 big imbalances at the macro scale. But Ecosoft doesn't balance at the macro scale, it balances at the micro scale. And that's actually fine, because we don't need X4 to be balanced like a competitive RTS, we just need it to be reasonably respectful of the player's time, and I think that's something we can mostly accomplish by making micro-scale adjustments to add some depth and nuance to ships' offensive and defensive equipment. There are plenty of tweaks we could make, so I'm going to run you through the ones that I think would be the most impactful, and then you can let me know what you think down in the comments. I think the key to closing the time investment gap between low and high attention is to adjust the low attention accuracy system for primary weapons. Currently, turrets and primary weapons have separate accuracy systems, and only the one for turrets incorporates the target's size and speed. I'd love to see at least some version of that same system applied to primary weapons as well. That would bring low attention back towards some sort of parity with high attention, and would also help to close the performance gap between burst and sustained DPS weapons. Different loadouts would be optimal against different targets in low attention, as opposed to just spamming plasma against everything, which I think would make the game more interesting and more balanced. So, that low attention accuracy system is the set of changes I'd most like to see in offensive equipment. I'm sure Ecosoft will make plenty more micro-scale adjustments to weapons and turrets, but that's the one I think will be most impactful on broader game balance. That leaves us with ships' defensive systems, which I think can be adjusted in minor ways that collectively address the remainder of my big imbalances. Let's go back to subcapitals versus capitals. I think it's absolutely fine that fighters are better damage dealers than destroyers. It's even fine that fighters are overwhelmingly better damage dealers than destroyers. What isn't fine is that destroyers don't get anything in exchange for being poor damage dealers. Keeping things pretty simple, the other roles that seem to make the most sense for destroyers would be battlefield control or just tanking damage. We already have some semblance of battlefield control in the Ray, and you can sort of shoehorn the other destroyers in with the right missile selection, but they all still fall short of the control you can exert with subcapitals. So that's one option, adding more battlefield control options to capital ships' weaponry, similar to what the Ray has. Option 2 is the one I've focused more on, and that's tanking. Capital class shields completely negate small amounts of sustained DPS, but they're terrible at absorbing burst damage, which makes capital combat an all-or-nothing threshold-based system that not only isn't great for capitals, but also adds to the imbalance between burst and sustained DPS weapons. So I think we can fix both of those things by adjusting capital ships' profiles of raw HP versus HP recovery. My opinion is that there should be a moderate reduction in shield recharge, or an increase in recharge delay, coupled with a big increase in raw HP. Specifically, I'd increase the hull HP of all surface elements, and I'd give destroyers and battleships additional hull HP that inversely scales with their intended engagement range. For example, the Asgard sits out at 14 kilometers, so that's our baseline with no hull bonus. The Xenon capitals operate at about 5 kilometers, so they'd get the biggest bonus, and then all the other destroyers and the Earl King would be distributed in between those values. I'd rather see adjustments to hull HP than to shield HP because that keeps the changes specific to the ship and therefore adds more diversity to the game's capital ship lineup. You could also pair it up with changes to ships' drone capacity and by extension their hull repair rate, just to add an extra bit of nuance. None of that is going to let destroyers suddenly beat fighters in a DPS race, but it will give them something unique to bring to the table, which I personally think is better. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on how Egosoft's micro-scale balancing style could be theoretically applied to address some of the macro-scale issues I've seen in my testing. It's not going to make the game perfectly fair and balanced, but I think it will make the game more interesting and more generally respectful of the player's time. I'm sure there are plenty of other ways to accomplish the same thing, and plenty of other things that could be achieved in the same way, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you'll tune in next time, and until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.